Okay, so moving on to the main event. So we're very fortunate today to have Eduardo Campillo-Funollet, who works at the University of Sussex and is one of the kind of main members of Discus in terms of the research he carries out. So Eduardo did his PhD in maths, but it was through some of these Discus exploration problems he ended up moving over to tackle some of the challenges within the Sussex Genome Centre. But he's also involved in an awful lot of other of our Discus projects. I'm sure Eduardo's going to be talking about some of them today. So if you have any questions during the talk, put them in the chat. We'll try and get Eduardo to answer them after the end. Otherwise, I'll hand over to you, Eduardo.
Thank you very much, Peter. And thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Let me share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yeah, got it.
Okay, good. So yeah, as I was saying, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. As Peter was saying, I'm a mathematician, so I work in data science, but my background was it's actually pure math, and then I moved to applied math for my PhD. And I think that gives me a slightly different perspective to data science in terms of what I understand for a model and what I look for when I work with a mathematical model. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit about the concept of a model and what is the right model and what we try to model. And then I will give you a couple of examples of work we did with, I brought here mathematical models, but I should say mechanistic models. So problems where we write models for the mechanisms that produce the data. And, so the two case studies will be, one will be COVID here in Sussex, some work we did with the NHS, and the second one will be crime, the number of crimes in Cape Town in South Africa. So as Peter said, please use the chat for questions. I'll try to answer questions as they come, but it's difficult to have my attention in two different places. So otherwise I will answer at the end. So let me start with a question, a very simple question. So if I give you this series of numbers, 2, 4, 6, 8, and I plot them here nicely in this graph, well, that's going to be difficult. I was going to ask, what's going to be the next number? Let's say, I think I can see if you raise your hand. Let me see that. So how many people think that the next number is going to be 10? Right. But why 10? I mean, why not say 42? And in fact, when I produced this data, based on an example I adapted from a paper, actually the next number was 42. So I produced this data using a polynomial, and the four first numbers are 2, 4, 6, 8, and the next one in the series is 42. But most of the people, when faced with these 4 data points, will think about 10, right? So why do you think, or why do we think the next number is 10? And well, the simplest answer is that it's the simplest model you can find out about this data, right? It's much better to think, or it seems much better to think that the data comes from a simple straight line, a linear model, rather than any fancy model like a 4th degree polynomial that I use here. And actually, if you don't know anything else other than these 4 data points, the most sensible answer is 10, because you can think about this as a model selection problem. So in terms of statistics, you can reproduce the 4 data points you see as good as, or as well as, with a linear model as with my 4-degree polynomial, and I need less parameters to represent the model, right? And actually 42 was a completely random choice. I could, if I use a degree 4 polynomial, I could pick any point and have a similar line. But what is interesting about this example is that the issue here is that we're trying to model the data. So we're trying to model the 4 data points we see, but we're not thinking about, because I don't say anything about the mechanism that produces these 4 points. And if I tell you that the mechanism is linear, or it's some physical mechanism that has a linear behavior, then we know for sure the answer is 10. But if I give you more information about the mechanism, it may be more clear than 10 is not the right answer. And this is a sort of artificial example, but this happens all the time with real problems. And I'm going to show you now a problem that is in the opposite extreme of choosing the model. And again, this next example is not based on my work. It's work I took from some papers that will reference in the next slide. But the idea here is the following. So when there's an earthquake, one of the big risks is the aftershocks afterwards. So that's a smaller, or typically smaller earthquakes that happen as a consequence of the shift produced by the original earthquake. And these are extremely dangerous because usually what happens is that you have a big earthquake, say the buildings, the structures of the buildings are damaged, and then even a smaller earthquake can completely destroy what's left of the buildings. So it's an important problem, and one question is, can we predict the aftershocks once the main earthquake happen? And the data here is where the main earthquake happened, which is the yellow grid in this plots, and the displacement at the main earthquake. So we can think about this as a fault earthquake, where two pieces of earth displace with respect to each other. What people did to try to predict this is to actually use this information. So how was the change produced by the first earthquake to compute the stress in the surrounding area. So this is literally, you can imagine this like you take a piece of rubber and you displace the center of it. That's your main earthquake. Now you have tension, stresses elsewhere. And it seems natural to think that where stress accumulates, there's a higher probability of an aftershock. So there's big data sets about this. So the data looks like this. So you have the location of the main earthquake, and then you have a black dot for each aftershock. And it's a very natural problem to tackle with a neural network, right? Because it's a huge data set. The actual underlying mechanisms are not that clear. You can relate them to the stress that accumulates, but it's not trivial to say more things about this. So the and Vigas in 2018 used a deep neural network to model this. So to try to predict the aftershocks. And so they use a fully connected DNN with 6 layers, 50 neurons per layer. What I want to point here is that this boils down to about 13,000 parameters that are calibrated during the training of the model of the neural network. And so the train set they use has 131,000 pairs of main earthquake and aftershock, and then they test the results with a 30,000 data set. And I reproduce here one of the figures of the paper with a ROC curve of the performance of this classifier. As you can see, it has an area under the curve of 0.84, which is quite good actually. And they concluded that this deep neural network was doing a good job of predicting this. It's interesting to note though that this red dot here indicates the optimal false positive rate to maximize precision, and precision was like was about 5 or 6%. So even with this ROC curve, the precision of the classifier was not great. But can we? So when we do this, when we go down the route of using, in this case, a fully connected neural network, essentially we're trying to find the whole model that generates this data. If we think back about the example with my 4 dots on a line, we're trying to find what produced that dot first. A year after this paper, there was a response paper saying, well, this is great, but I can do the same with only one neuron, which is essentially doing logistic regression. And they took the same data set, exactly the same data set. They fit this model here, which only have 1, 2 parameter, which is the beta 1, because you adjust beta 0 to make sure this is a probability. And they achieved essentially the same area under the curve than using the large neural network. There's a small difference between the 2 papers, but the difference is due, well, most probably is due to not using exactly the same split between train and test. So they use the same overall data set, but the random split between train and test is different for the 2 papers. So this is a small difference, is most possibly just stochastic. But here we see that it may not be at the end, one shouldn't expect this model to work better than the neural network, because in some sense, you can train the neural network with the 6 layers to be this one neural network, right? But it shows that the most of the neural network was not actually useful to understand this data. And they went a step further and calibrate the second logistic regression model, now using 2 parameters. Now, for the neural network and for the previous logistic regression model, the only data they were using was the stress. For this one, instead of computing the stress, they simply use the distance from the position where you want to bring the aftershock, and the main earthquake. That's that's R, and D is the displacement, the slip in the fault. So the slip caused by the main earthquake. So these are actually the 2 of the ingredients that you use to compute the stress afterwards. And using this model, they actually achieve better results. I mean, marginally better if you want, but they achieve better results than with the full neural network. Now, this is very interesting because, well, there's if you want, a more theoretical question of why the neural network was not able to reproduce this very simple model. But it shows that having knowledge about the system, so having a little bit of knowledge about what the data represents, can actually provide an improvement in comparison to a blunt approach of taking in this case, a neural network, and just training a classifier. And I mean, in some sense, this is the the well-known the neural network here is the canon, and this is just a fly. So you don't need these 13,000 parameters to fit a classifier for this data. So just to summarize a little bit the ideas I've been touching here, I mean, there's a difference between modeling the data and modeling the system that produces the data. And modeling the system is what we usually understand as more mathematical modeling rather than statistics or machine learning. There's this idea that when we train something like a neural network, we're actually finding the model in terms of the model that models the system, rather than just modeling the data. But there's a scope for using mechanistic models when the problem permits. And I'm not claiming we should always use one thing or the other. Far from that. I'm saying some problems are very suitable for models where we can incorporate the knowledge that we have about the mechanisms that produce the data, rather than looking at the data in a more agnostic manner. And the rest of my talk will be to show two of these mechanistic models, as I mentioned at the beginning. So let's move to the first one. Little bit of background here. So the problem at hand was, so there's the crime dynamics in Cape Town are characterized by two very distinct types of regions in the city, of neighborhoods, if you want. And this map shows these two types of neighborhoods. And essentially, what happens is that there are neighborhoods with high criminality rates, where most of the social life goes around crime and gangs. And then there's other neighborhoods with a more baseline criminality rate. And the dynamics of crime, so how criminals organize and commit crimes in the two different types of neighborhood are very different. So what we wanted to do here was to find a simple model to understand the relation between the dynamics in both neighborhoods. Now, just to explain you a little bit about this map was compiled using data for 1 year, so for 2005, and the map just reflects, so the boundaries are police department boundaries, and the color just reflects the murder rate. So red is over 1 murder per year per 1,000 inhabitants, and green is under that. The threshold is slightly arbitrary, if you want, but the general classification between the neighborhood is the same if you look at other types of crime. The reason to use murder was to avoid, so in the data set is very rich, but it compiles all crimes. And for this kind of study, we were not interested in non-violent crimes, essentially. So crimes like domestic disturbance were not what we were trying to model here. So we took this data, 12 years of data provided by the South African Police Department, used this classification and just tried to model one average red area and one average green area. And I'm not going to show you the equations because I had the feeling that they were not appealing for this audience, but I'm going to explain the model using the map. So the idea is that there are criminals in both types of area. but criminals from red areas are more organized, and in consequence, they defend their territory better, and they go to commit crimes to the green areas, whilst the criminals in the green areas only commit crimes within their neighborhood. On the other hand, because crime is an important part of social life in the red areas, the number of criminals in the red areas is it self-reinforces. So the more criminals are there, the more people will become a criminal, essentially because they try to follow what they see around them. And that's what the model was trying to represent. And then, of course, in both areas, there's you remove criminals by police action, and there's a source term, so there's new criminals created every year just because of the overall situation. It's important to note, though, that we don't know anything about the number of criminals. What we know from the data is the number of crimes. So the other thing that the model does is it relates the number of criminals, which is the dynamics we want to understand, to the number of crimes that we observe. And it does so by saying the fraction of the crimes. So for a criminal from a red area, a fraction of the crimes is committed in the green areas, and the other fraction of the crimes is committed within their own neighborhood. For the green areas, all the crimes are committed in their own neighborhood. So we brought down the ordinary differential equation for this model. We calibrated it using Bayesian methods, a Markov-Chain Monte Carlo approach. We split the data, so there's only, once you average all the reds and all the greens, there's only 12 data points for each color, for each type of neighborhood. So we split the data and we use 5 data points as a train set and 7 as a test. I mean, we didn't do an actual test, but the other 7 were not used during the training. And so here is the result that we got for the number of crimes. What you see here is the markers. The solid markers are the training points. The blank markers are the test points. Red corresponds to a high crime area, green corresponds to a low crime area. And the lines are the output of the model. And you can see that the model was provided a very good fit just by eye. I did not reproduce here the 11 parameters, but the parameters are things like number of crimes per year per criminal, number of criminals removed from the system by the police, etc. And there's a couple of parameters that are more, well, less linked to real values, which represent this self-reinforcement behavior in high crime areas. I wouldn't say you cannot do this with a purely statistical approach. I mean, if I give you this data and you use any method to model this data, you may get similar results. But what is more interesting in this case is that with the model, we can do some analysis. And we can understand things like what are the equilibriums of the system. So here by equilibrium, I simply mean, is there any number of criminals that once achieved, the system doesn't change anymore? And the answer is yes, there are several equilibriums. There's only one stable equilibrium, meaning there's only one equilibrium that if you reach it, you will stay there. And I depicted it in this plot. So this would be the phase plane of the system, if you know what the phase plane is. But this simply depicts number of criminals for the low criminality regions against number of criminals in the high criminality regions. And what you see, so I got a point for each of my training data points and similarly for the test ones. And what you see here is the trajectory that the system is following in terms of the number of criminals. And so what happens in any system like this is that the trajectory converges to an equilibrium, right? And in this case, it converges to this point. But this shows us that in the current situation, the dynamics will be that the criminals in the number of criminals in the low criminality areas will keep decreasing until they reach this equilibrium. And the number of criminals in the high criminality areas will keep increasing until they reach this equilibrium. Now, this is in contrast to the number of crimes that you saw in the previous plot that are just increasing. And the reason is that criminals from the high criminality areas commit more crimes. So even if you decrease the criminals in the low criminality areas, the overall number of crimes in the city keeps increasing. And this plot has another interesting consequence, which is if I want to change the situation, if I want to apply some policy that essentially, in terms of our model, will represent modifying some of the parameters, like increase the police presence in the neighborhoods. This will mean we will move this equilibrium, and we know that if we are in this region here, we will converge in this direction. So unless we move it to the other side of the current situation, we will always have this increasing number of criminals in the high criminality areas decreasing in the low criminality areas. I wouldn't say this was a surprise, but it was not imposed in the model in advance. But then when we analyzed the results, some social scientists pointed us to some papers that show one of the problems in Cape Town is that in terms of policymakers, it's better to put resources in the low criminality areas, which are the good neighborhoods of the city, because that means more votes in the next election, neglecting the high criminality areas where nobody cares about what's going on. And this reflects the situation where you reduce the number of criminals because you increase police action to make people happy, but overall the number of crimes was still increasing. In any case, what I wanted to show you with this model is just one example of a relatively simple mechanistic model, not a perfect model, just as most mathematical models, just an approximation, but that shows some interesting results that allow some analysis. In the future, we plan to explore a little bit more about how one can move this equilibrium, and how, for instance, if you put a value on increasing police presence, what's the cheapest way to move this equilibrium in order to reduce the overall number of criminals. Now, the second example is about modeling of COVID-19 in Sussex. I wasn't sure about presenting this because I know the last talk in the meetup was about COVID, but that's why I wanted to have more than one example and keep this as small as possible. But the story here is that back in March, we had a meeting with local NHS trust, and essentially the question we were asked was, can we forecast hospital occupancy and mortality in the region? Now, there were several problems related to this question, and one is, at the time, I mean, I may say things that are not entirely right now, but that were correct 11 months ago. At the time, the national NHS was providing the local NHS with the national model, but it's not trivial, and I would say it's not even possible to just take the national model and make it work for your local region. Data was not readily available. In particular, data was not systematically collected as it is now. We had no testing data, so we had no information about things like the overall incidence of the disease. In the meeting, many people were interested in applying age structure models, but age structure data was not available either. So what we did was, okay, let's try to write a model. There is a minimal model that will allow us to make predictions on hospital capacity and death, but also that we can calibrate using only the data that we have at hand. And the model we use is this one, so it's a compartmental model, SIR type model. And if you know a little bit about SIR models, they essentially have a susceptible compartment, an infected compartment, and a recovered compartment. This is a little bit more elaborate. So there's, from the susceptible compartment, people go to an exposed compartment, meaning they are infected with the virus, but not infectious yet. And then in our model, we split the people in this compartment in two branches. So there's the U branch that we named U for undetected, which is all the people that we will not see through our data unless they die outside the hospital. We had mortality data, and at the time, deaths were recorded as COVID-related deaths, even without testing. Now, this is one of the things that changed at some point, and now, if you look at the statistics for death, COVID deaths means there was a positive test 28 days before, so within 28 days before the death date. But at the time, this was the only piece of information we had for this branch. Then the other branch is the branch of the people that will end up going through the hospital system. And again, so they go from the exposed compartment to the infectious compartment. Then at some point, they go to the hospital, and then from the hospital, they either recover or die. We have separate data set for death in hospitals, and we have the hospital data that actually it's 3 data sets related but independent, which are the admissions data set, the discharge data set, so the people going into hospital, out of the hospital, and daily occupancy data set. Now, in the diagram, I mark in color essentially where we have data. So we have data for this flow, the number of people dying every week. We have data for this flow admissions, data for this flow discharges, and data for this flow here, death in hospitals. And then we have data for this compartment, which is quite exceptional in terms of the daily occupancy of the hospital. So the model has only 8 parameters, which are these gammas and a beta hidden here, p's, m's, mu's. But if you want to use the model, so if you want to run a simulation with this model, we also need to know the initial conditions. And if you want to know the initial conditions for everything, you cannot make the model work because you don't have any data for S, E, U, and I, and H. Well, you have data for H, but you don't have any data for to start the simulation, right? So what we did, sorry for the typo here, so we reduced this model to what we call the observational model, which is simply taking the equations that come out of this diagram and rewriting them so they only have the terms for which we have data, which are essentially H, I through the flow into hospital, the U, the H, and RH in terms of the charge. Now that model, you can solve it, so you can run simulations with it, because it only depends on things that you have data for, that you can observe. And this avoids, well, this avoids overfitting, but also avoids problems on making decisions over compartments that you don't know anything about. And I want to point out here that even the susceptible compartment is not really known, because the real number of susceptibles is not the total population, it's some number below that number. Yeah, I just see the question now precisely. So no, we you, as I was saying, right? So you can assume things like it might be smaller than the total population, but you don't know how many susceptibles, or for that matter, for how many exposed or infected were at the beginning of the simulation. So we calibrated this model. In this case, we use a maximum likelihood estimation algorithm. We're planning to use a Bayesian method, but as I said, this work started as a collaboration with the NHS, and was urgent for them to have results. So we try to, rather than following a more academic pathway, we try to provide answers as quick as possible. So I forgot to remove this too. So with this, as I said before, no testing data, no structured data, only the data I mentioned. So what we quantified here in this plot is how well the model performed in terms of how many data points we used to calibrate it. And this is a little bit counterintuitive, but what this represents is, if I take, say, 15 data points and I calibrate my model, and then I make predictions 10 days into the future, 20 days into the future, 30 days into the future, how many of my predictions are within 1, 2, or 3 standard deviations of my data? And I say it's counterintuitive because here, 3 standard deviations is the easy thing to do, right? If I say I consider my prediction correct if it's within 3 standard deviations, most of my predictions are right. If I want to be within 1 standard deviation, that means my predictions are more accurate, and of course the performance is lower. But what we see here is that with just a few data points, we reach about 75% performance in terms of how many days are correctly predicted over a period of 90 days corresponding to the first lockdown. Interestingly, after 25 days, there's no much improvement. So there's no much point on using more than 25 data points to calibrate the model. And this motivated what we've been doing since then, which is we refit the model using the last 25 or 30 data points. Data for discharges was a little bit more noisier, possibly due to errors in the recording of the data, and the prediction was not as good. But overall, this shows a good performance of the model. And to give you a more global view of how the model performs, this is the overall performance of this model since April until October, with a confidence interval for the prediction. And keep in mind that we were refitting the model, and at 2 points, which I cannot remember now. One is around here. You can see there's 2 places around here and around here where the line makes a slight change. We did these 2 main recalibrations to account for changes in policy. So essentially, when we came out of the first lockdown, and when we reached September, and things started to look bad again. And we we've been using the model. Well, we still use the model, but November, as you may well remember, was a little bit crazy in terms of policy changes. So there's much more overfitting there and data changes a lot. But the overall performance is still good. And that's the end of my second example and the end of my talk, but I'll be happy to take questions now.
Brilliant. Cheers, Eduard. We'll give it a couple of seconds to see if anyone else has got any other questions. I guess while we're waiting, I'll just chuck one out there. So
yep.
In terms of fitting this model for COVID, recently, can you see changes in parameters related to the new Kent variant?
Yes, but it's hard to tell. So, I mean, the model, so how this new variant will reflect in the model is in changes in the infectivity parameter. So how often people infect, so how often an infectious person infects another one. But this parameter also represents things like the lockdown. So it's hard to disentangle from the fitting what is policy changes, like we are all at home, and what is due to new variants and things like that. What's interesting, and we actually analyzed in the paper, is the other parameters like how the average duration of the infection or the average duration of the infectious period is slightly different from the national averages, and that reflects on the different demographics of the population in Sussex. Essentially, the average person is slightly older than in the rest of the country, for instance. And these are much more easier to analyze. So yes, I'm using discharge as a proxy for recovery from hospital. That's correct. So essentially, that I can go well. This recovered RH is people who were discharged from hospital after being diagnosed with COVID.
Also, Teresa's asking if you can get a link to the paper.
Yeah, sure.
Will you be able to put that in the chat, or I can put it
up?
Yeah,
I can put it in the chat. Just give me a second to find it. Here you go.
Awesome. And we've got one more question from Simon there.
Yeah.
Policy changes require a total refitting, or if you can incorporate.
So yes, precisely. So what we try to do is to say the main change in policy is essentially the susceptible to exposed compartment. Most of the rest of the parameters, except with the appearance of the new variants, will remain the same for the same population. The idea is that when you have a big policy change like the lockdown, the rate from the susceptible to exposed changes, and the rest of the parameters remain the same. The average duration of the disease more or less remains the same. Again, this is a rough approximation over time, and especially over 1 year, because it's been 1 year now. Some of the parameters change because we get new treatments, you get a slightly different average population, because more people in certain age groups are dying. But the main change in the model due to the policy is just this one parameter. It's also one of the more sensitive. So it's the one that when you fit it wrong, the model changes most. How did you get? So how did I get involved? As far as I remember, so I did not organize the original meeting, but as far as I remember, the original meeting was organized because somebody was already collaborating with the NHS local trust on a different project. I think it was for mental health. And because of that contact, they thought it could be a good idea to establish a COVID modeling group. And I mean, the NHS was establishing their own modeling cell, and through that link, they reached to the university.
And I think Sussex in more general has a lot of connections with the.
Yes, yes. I mean, I'm talking about my particular case and this particular work. There's all other connections between Sussex and the NHS and other modeling work from Sussex.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, if there's no other questions, thank you very much again, Eduard.
Good. Thank you.
Just a few more things to bring up before we call it a day. So yeah, I just want to bring to your attention another meetup, which is almost like the sister meetup for the Sussex Data Science Group, and that's the Brighton Data Forum. So I think this covers more general, wider data topics. It's like business analytics and databases and what have you. And they've also got a very good Slack group with a lot of members where people are discussing different challenges, questions, coding problems and what have you. So the QR code points to that Slack group. So I'd encourage people to join that. And their next meetup's on Wednesday, the 31st of March. And then I guess that's it. So our next meetup's planned for the 15th of April. So please come along and join us for that meetup. The speaker's yet to be announced. But if you'd like to talk at these meetups, any of them in the future, then just get in touch with me. And you can sign up now for that next meetup, again with this QR code, which takes you to the meetup page. So I think that's it from us. Thank you for joining. Thanks again to Eduard. And if people want to stay online for a couple more minutes, just for a brief chat, then feel free. Otherwise, we'll see you in a couple of months' time.